discussing relationships and sexual health with youth. Today's presenter is Michaeline Davis. Michaeline is a reproductive health educator at Maternal and Family Health Services. Her background includes 5 years of working with adolescents and adults to facilitate discussion around sexual and reproductive health, with topics including safer sex methods, STD prevention, healthy relationships, and body image. Michaeline has earned her master's degree in clinical psychology from Marywood University and a master's of education in human sexuality from Widener University. She's passionate about helping individuals make healthy choices for themselves. She is committed to promoting accurate, unabashed, and comprehensive sexuality education for youth and adults in northeastern Pennsylvania's area. I'm going to turn it over to you, Michaeline.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you for that introduction. When you have a chance, can you reshare the slides?
Yep, I'm going to pull the slides up.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, bright and early on a Monday morning, and I think it might be a bright day, so let's hope for that. So as Joe was just saying, I am a reproductive health educator, and I work for Maternal and Family Health Services. If I am speaking too fast at some point, please feel free to put it in the chat that I need to slow down. Please also feel free to put questions that you have in the chat, although I will probably mostly only look at them at the end. There will be a few times during our conversation this morning that I will ask you to participate, either through the chat or possibly out loud, although I think chat's probably going to be easier for our purposes this morning. So, good morning. My name's Michaeline, but I do go by Mickey, and I work for MFHS. Next slide, please. So at Maternal and Family Health Services, this is our mission statement. We are an innovative health and human service organization dedicated to meeting the needs of the community through information, education, and quality care. So care is really important to us. You can see here our service area. So obviously we are very much in Luzerne County. We have quite a few programs. Next slide, please. Those programs do include the WIC nutrition program. So all of those counties that you just saw, we have WIC in those counties. We also provide reproductive health, which includes things like family planning, prenatal care, healthy visits, gynecological visits. We have a program called Nurse Family Partnership, which, if you're not familiar, is a very, very cool program where first-time parents who are within an income guideline can actually be paired with a nurse who will visit their home throughout their pregnancy and up to 2 years of their child's life. Just to make sure things are as expected, to help remind them to go to appointments. And the joke that I always make is when my aunt was a baby and she is in her mid-60s, she wouldn't keep her formula down. So the doctor told my grandmother to give her a little bit of beer before she took her bottle. Now in 2020, we're like, wait, give my baby what? So instead of going to my grandmother and saying, Grandma, my child won't keep her formula down, I could go to my nurse family partner and they could give me, updated information, like get this special type of formula. So that's the example I always use from my own life. We also offer cancer screenings through our reproductive health program, through pap smears and the like. We do have some pregnancy care, breastfeeding education. Last month was National Breastfeeding Month, and so we had lots of education coming out. And we also do teen services. So you can see on your screen, it says Safe Teens. That is referring to our website and also a text line that we run. Next slide, please. So you can see here, like I said, we have some education services. To the left of your screen, that is just a screenshot of our website. So if you went to the mfhs.org website and clicked on services and education, this is what you would see. As I said, we have a text line for anybody who has texting as part of their cell phone plan. It's the same as any other text, or if you pay as you go, it costs the same as texting a friend. And that program is confidential. So young people can know when they text in, they don't have to be concerned that that person that they text with is going to go and tell whoever it is who pays their cell phone bill what they were talking about, unless, of course, HIPAA and safety measures. So mandated reporting still applies, but other than that, it is confidential. And I point that out because as we will get into in a few moments when we talk about talking to youth about sexuality, a question I get a lot is, are you going to tell my parents I asked you about this? The folks at the text line will not. It's also important to know that that text line is a partnership with Responsible Sex Education Institute. So those are the folks who are answering. And you can check out their website. They've got a lot of really great resources also. Finally, we do in-person education, and that is my job. So as we mentioned, I am a reproductive health educator, and I cover a lot of topics. Some of the most common topics that I'm asked to cover are healthy relationships. And then, of course, there's always things like STI prevention, pregnancy prevention, so risk prevention. And I always make a point of saying my job is really helping folks prevent things, helping folks learn how to prevent things so that we're not at a place where we have to make difficult decisions. So it's really always a focus on learning what we need to know before we make decisions that might put us in some sticky situations. We also have a curriculum that I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So next slide, please. Oh, interesting. I lied. We'll talk about the curriculum in a few moments. So today I would certainly like to know some about you. We're going to talk a little bit about me, but I also want to know about you. So if you could, please in the chat, let us know who you are. If you are comfortable, please do tell us your pronoun. Pronouns include things like he, she, a gender neutral pronoun may be they. Another neo pronoun is here. So again, if you're comfortable, please let us know your pronoun. And then tell us what brought you here this morning. So do you work with youth? Are you a parent? What made you decide that you wanted to learn more about this? And then finally, how comfortable are you currently with this topic? So if young people wanted to speak to you today, before, or let's say yesterday, before you had this presentation, would you be very comfortable? Like, no problem at all? That's a 10. So that would be like, I'm super comfortable. If you're not comfortable and you get really red in the face, maybe you trip over your words, or you just don't know what to say, that would be like a 1. So let me reopen the chat. Also, Joe, so that you know, somebody chatted in that they are unable to join the meeting, and that was Judy Welch. I'm not sure if you can see that.
Yeah.
Also, not to put too much on your plate, if you could go to the next slide.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So I've reproduced the please tell me about you. I'm going to let you know about me. Like I said, I go by Mickey. You can call me Michaeline. I love my name. I just also like Mickey. And I use female, she, her pronouns. So female as in typically people who identify as female use them. The way I work with youth is that I am a reproductive health educator, which puts me interacting with youth quite often. And I would say I'm about a 9. And the reason I'd say I'm about a 9 is I recognize there are still some times that I just don't know where the questions are coming from or don't know exactly how I want to answer them. So I do see a few folks. Good morning, Vanessa. Good morning, Kendra, Jennifer. Good morning, Renee. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Good morning, Lori. Would anybody like to tell us verbally how comfortable they are? I've seen quite a few folks in the chat, and it looks like so far the lowest number I've seen is a 5. The highest I've seen is a 9. So part of the point of this, my friends, is just I want to get kind of a feel about, you know, where my audience is. I do see somebody has a 10 now. I see a 6, so. Next slide, please. So to give you just a little more information about how I work with youth, at Maternal and Family Health Services, we have 2 programs that are primarily what take up the majority of my work time. One is called a Health Resource Center, which we have branded as Safe Space to fall in line with our Safe Teens programs. And that is a partnership currently specifically with Scranton School District, where I actually have an office in 2 of their high schools, or their 2 high schools, where young people can come and see me confidentially one-on-one. And the intention is to break down the barriers to healthcare. So young people can come to me and ask questions that maybe they're not comfortable asking their guardians or their parents or their adults. Excuse me. They can also come to me and have help making an appointment. So sometimes just having somebody sit with you or being able to ask what questions will they ask me on the phone. So the idea really is to ease access to care. And we have a partnership with the Wright Center, so we refer there a lot. And also we have our own dedicated family planning service in Scranton called Circle of Care. So those are the two places I most typically work with. I also have a program that we deliver through Maternal and Family Health Services called the Personal Responsibility Education Program, or PREP, all capitals in PREP. So if anybody works in the reproductive health field, there's also capital P, lowercase r, capital E, capital P. That's a different PREP, although I talk about it during my PREP. And PREP is, for us, we use it to deliver in a scripted HIV prevention curriculum. So it is a 6-session program that we have added 2 sessions to. Each session is 50 to 60 minutes each, and it includes games, lecture, worksheets. We make it as interactive as it possibly can be. So that gives you some idea of how and when I'm working with youth. I do also have the flexibility within my programs to be able to do smaller activities with young people. I know some of you have actually been in those with me, so thank you for being here this morning. It's always good if folks come back to your presentations, right? So if anybody's thinking, wow, I would really like some of these services for my young people or for my program, but you don't know that you can commit to something like a curriculum, that's okay. Give me a call, give me a shout out, and we can talk about doing something smaller and maybe building up to the curriculum. So next slide, please. Here's what I hope to cover this morning. I'd really like to talk about what the scope of sexuality education is, because often in my career, I've heard misunderstandings of what we're talking about. I'd like to also recognize some common pitfalls that we make when talking with youth about sexuality. And because of those pitfalls, I'd like to share with you all some tips, tricks, some suggestions to make these talks easier and more successful. Next slide. All right, so let's pretend. Let's go back in our minds to when we were younger, to when we were the youth per se. So let's pretend we're around 16, or if you like, you could say 15, 14. So you're a mid-teenager. So you're starting to wonder about sexuality. You're starting to have feelings for other folks. Who do you talk to? Really put yourself back in that place. Think about what music you were listening to, where you kept your notes. Did you have a journal? Did you have a trapper keeper? Are you on the younger side and you keep them in your phone? Think about that. So feel free to chat in if you have chat availability. If not, just think about it in your brain. But who do you talk about with sex? Like, who do you go to when you have questions? What words do you use? We'll talk about language in a moment, but I can tell you the words change all the time, and that can sometimes be a difficulty in talking with people who are a different generation than you. More importantly, what adults do you talk to? Like, would you go to an adult? Do you have an adult who's your go-to? How do you feel when adults talk to you about sexuality? Do you kind of groan in your head and go, ugh, this again? Then, if you are talking to adults, what messages do you hope you're getting? What do you wish that you were hearing? So is anybody thinking, wow, I probably wouldn't have talked to my parents. I wouldn't have talked to the people living in my house. You can raise your hand if you felt that way. Or you can do a little hand raise if you have that function. Yeah, I'm seeing some hand raising. Does anybody in their mind, in their 16-year-old mind go, I talk to my friends. I talk to other 16, 17-year-olds. Yeah. Okay, so I have somebody chatted in and said, as a teen, they mostly spoke with their peers and siblings. I hear that a lot. I did have somebody chat in and say they talked to their grandma and their mother. Another person shared that they talked to friends. They didn't really have adults they could talk to. They were told that sex was not for teens. So a message that they got was that teens should not be thinking about or having sex. I extrapolated there. I hope that's okay. All right, somebody said they talked to their mom and their teacher. Thank you for that, friends. A lot of times I hear young people say that they would never want to talk to their parents, that their parents are not the people, or even their teachers. Now, in the high schools that I work in, and in the high school I went to, there's usually one or two cool teachers. No offense to anybody who's not one of those cool teachers. You're still cool, but there are those teachers who are your go-tos. So there are those teachers who you know you can kind of say anything to. They're your safe space. Part of our presentation today is helping you become one of those people who's a safe space. Next slide, please. All right, so first of all, we have to know what we're talking about if we're talking about sex. And sex is a lot more than body parts and activities. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the things that I often talk about a lot. So I just saw another chat. Thank you so much for sharing. So some things that sex include is our identity. So who we know ourselves to be, who we know ourselves to be attracted to, who we want to be active with if we want to be active. Also, our gender identity, our sexual orientation, all of these things are part of our identity, and they are part of our human sexuality. So the interesting thing about this topic is often these conversations start before we're even born, right? So when you find out somebody's pregnant, you go, oh, what are you having? Is it a boy or a girl? And before that child has even been born, we start ascribing things to them, right? The things that we ascribe to them are gender roles. So that includes things like, what are boys or girls supposed to do? What are they allowed to do? So quick share, my brother has a 20-month-old daughter, and it was really funny the day he and I were talking. He's like, wait, I'm gonna have to play with Barbies. And I was just like, dude, you love football. Just get enough Barbies to play football with her. It'll be awesome. So oftentimes we get kind of caught up in those what can or cannot people do. And these roles are reinforced by how we, the adults in our young people's lives, how we react to their behavior. So going back to the chat where a young person said they couldn't talk to the adults in their life because they one time started and they got a negative reaction probably, right? Maybe they asked a question and whoever they asked it of got really upset or actually specifically told them, don't ask me that. So sometimes we may react before we think. I'm hoping to help you think how to react before you do that. Also, through these reactions, we give values regarding that behavior, right? So what's okay, what's not. And these are things we are learning through our entire lives. Now, the thing that people most frequently think of when we talk about sex education or sexual health education is activities. So what activities constitute sex? And then remember I talked about language and how it changes? Let's just think about if one of these words works for you. So I hear young people talking about talking. So we don't date anymore. We don't go steady anymore. We talk to a person, which I can tell you is weirdly awkward to me because I always say this to my young people. I talk to people all day. I am not intimate with anybody but my partner. So this saying that we are talking to somebody seems very, very minimizing to how intimate these relationships can really be. But I've also heard things like parking and necking that might be from a slightly older generation, like my parents' generation. We had boyfriends and girlfriends, or we went all the way when I was in school. I do see some hands. For those folks who have hands, are you looking to add something, or are you just agreeing? All right, I will guess that we are just agreeing. Next slide, please. So how do we talk about sex? What kind of message do we share? I know a lot of times folks will say to me when they learn that I'm a sexuality educator or a reproductive health educator, they'll go, well, why that? Why did you pick that? And I always think to myself, if I said I was a chemist, would you ask why that? And maybe yes, but also maybe no. So for me, part of it is because sexuality was always taboo. And it was never something that was difficult for me personally to talk about. So that kind of led me into the career. So I know a lot of people in service professions will say, I didn't choose the career, it chose me. Same is true for me. But so many other people, talking about sex is taboo. It's not done, it's not comfortable, it's intimidating, right? So we get really worried about what if we say the wrong thing. The thing that we need to remember is that sometimes this discomfort can lead to inadvertently shaming messages. So going back to this idea of if a young person asks you questions and you go, what? You are way too young for that. They're going to hear that they did something wrong. Or other things like, because maybe we don't want our kindergarteners going to school and talking about body parts, we might use different words for those body parts, right? So disclaimer, friends, I'm going to now say body part words. So you might not want your 5-year-old in kindergarten to talk about penises and vulvas and vaginas. So instead we use words like pee-pee and wee-wee, cookie, hoo-ha. So we use these different words. The thing is, if we don't, and I always say this, so what's this? And people will say to me, it's your nose. I say, what's this? It's our elbow. What's this? It's your neck. So if we don't have different words for those body parts, but then we do have different words for other body parts, what message are we sharing about those body parts? We're kind of saying that they're not to be talked about, which can lead to some uncomfortable situations down the road, and also doesn't allow people the space to learn sometimes about those different body parts. Next slide. Oh, thank you. Quick drink. Sometimes the reason we get so concerned or upset when young people ask questions is because we're not sure exactly what they're asking. So there are not just two types of questions, but they often can fall into these two different categories. So our young people may be asking questions that are factual or questions about values. So for instance, a factual question would be, where do babies come from? Has anybody ever known somebody who their young person came to them and said, Mommy or Daddy or Nana or whoever you live with, where do babies come from? And that parent or guardian went, oh man, okay, it's time. All right, so sweetie, when a mommy and a daddy love each other very, very much, and they go into this whole thing, that's great. I'm so glad that people are thinking that they need to do that. But oftentimes that 5-year-old's not actually asking about making love, if you will, which is not a word I use often, but that's what a parent might say, right? Oftentimes that 5-year-old might be asking because, you know, so-and-so on the bus said that they come from a stork, but they remember when their aunt was pregnant and the baby was in their belly. And even that. So do young people think that babies are literally in bellies? Because I've heard stories about young people worrying that the babies would be hurt by the stomach acid since that's where food's digested. So that child's probably not asking for any kind of value information, which how people have children and when and why, those are values. They're asking for factual things like, do they come from a parent or do they come from a stork? The values questions are the ones that are often much more difficult because then we need to assess, what do we want to share? Where do we want the conversation to go? And it's really important for me as an educator to always point out that when I'm speaking with young people, it is not my job to share values. It's not my job to give my values to those young people. And I often turn them back to the people they're living with. So if somebody asks me something like, when is it okay for me to have sex? What age is a good age to start having sex? That's a values question because that's going to depend on your culture. It's going to depend on maybe your religion. It's going to depend on how your family feels about things like marriage. So I'm not up here saying you can have sex when you're 16. I'm not up here saying you can have sex when you get married. I'm here saying, you know, that's really a thing that each different person needs to decide for themselves based on a lot of different factors. Who do you think you might be able to talk to about that? And then the young people start telling me who they might be able to talk to. So when we're presented with questions, we need to assess, is this a values question or is it factual? And we'll talk about how to do that in a second. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, sometimes we run into a little bit of trouble and inadvertently we give shaming messages. So we may say something incorrect, like, you know, the child who learned that babies come from storks, maybe their parents weren't ready to talk about the fact that babies come from sex, so that was the story they came up with. This can lead to confusion, as I already talked about. Sometimes, if we give misinformation and then youth find out that that information was incorrect, youth may then check out. We may have just inadvertently hurt their trust in us. This can happen too sometimes with larger education programs, like abstinence-only education programs. So abstinence-only education programs don't give people the information of how to say yes. So kids can kind of tune out sometimes because they go, oh, this isn't for me. Or sometimes heteronormative education. So that would be education that assumes that everybody is in heterosexual relationships. So if we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about people and what they need to know about sexuality and sexual activity, and we're only talking about males and females having sex. Males who want to have sex with males may check out, or women who may want to have sex with women may check out because they'll say, oh, well, I'm not interested in that, so this doesn't affect me. Which isn't necessarily true, because down the road, you don't know what kind of activities folks may engage in. So some examples of these inadvertent shaming messages. Boys will be boys. So I'm sure we've all had this one. Little girl comes home crying because a boy pushed her down on the playground and the adults in her life go, oh, that just means he likes you. Well, what are we setting her up for down the road to think, okay, he pushed me down because he likes me, right? Is that the message we want to send? Another message might be teens are too young to be having sex. Teens are a broad age. There's a lot of numbers in teens, right? We've got all the way from 13 to 19. So that may be too much of a blanket statement. Or this is an example actually right from my own career, where I was doing a group with young people and there was an adult. I always make sure there's a staff person in the room with me. And the young person asked a question about some type of sexual activity that clearly the adult in the room was not comfortable with. And they went, but you're never going to do that, right? And I was like, okay, hold on. We're not really here to talk about what people are or are not doing or what they're going to do. We're here to learn about what we might need to think about. So just some quick examples. Next slide, please. And my favorite example, if you've seen the movie Mean Girls, you might remember Coach Carr. He is a physical ed teacher who is put in the position of a health teacher. He does not seem like he likes it very much. So he says things like, don't have sex because you will get pregnant and die. Don't have sex in the missionary position. Don't have sex standing up. Just don't do it, okay? Promise? Okay, now everybody take some rubbers. Now, even that, what are we saying here? Don't do it, but in case you're going to, here's some rubbers. No education about what rubbers are, how to use them, when to use them, where to get them if you didn't take them today. So not a great example. Next slide, please. So in my field, we talk a lot about being sex positive, which sometimes people hear that and they go, I'm not out here trying to encourage people to have sex, which is never what our job is. It's never about telling people what to do. And I think about it a lot like when we're talking about drug and alcohol prevention. We're not explaining to people to go do drugs or alcohol. We're explaining why we shouldn't and what we need to think about around those things. The same is true for sex education. So some tips for being sex positive. 1, stay calm. If you need to, take a breath. That's okay. Number 2, know yourself. It's really important to know your own values and your own limits. If you're going to be doing work with young people and having these conversations come up, it's important to know what you are comfortable talking about and what you're not. So if you're not comfortable talking about risk reduction, don't go down that road. Say, hey, that's not really something I know a lot about, or that's not something I feel it's appropriate for me to talk about, but here are some resources. If you're just not sure what they're really asking, ask for clarification. Say, hey, that's a really great question. Thank you for asking. What made you bring that up today? And that way you can ensure that you're actually knowing what they really mean. So going back to my example of the little girl asking about the stork, that young person was not really asking about people choosing to be parents because they're in love. That person was asking literally, where do babies come from? Because I heard this. So if we go back to that story, the workaround, the fix would have been, that's a really great question, honey. What made you ask that today? Did you hear something? Did you learn something new at school? What's making you thinking about that? And then that gives you time too to think about your own message. What message do you want to send? Do you want to send a message that could be misconstrued? Also, sometimes we need to pause and think about how whatever we're saying might be heard. So I had that happen just recently. A young person shared with me that they identify as trans. And I said, okay, tell me what that means to you. A few weeks later, they come back and they're like, oh, you remember how you asked why I want to be trans? And I was like, whoa, wait, what? I didn't ask that. Now, I didn't react that way, but in my brain I did. I went, I don't remember asking that. Can you remind me about that conversation? And that's when I realized I said, what does that mean to you? But they heard, why do you want to be that? So those are different messages. And part of that is because language. Maybe I did not use the best language there. Maybe I could have asked a different question. It's also important to meet young people where they are. So as an educator, I prefer to use more clinical terminology. Sometimes that is not going to work with my youth. Sometimes I need to let them know they can use whatever words are comfortable for them within reason, right? We're not cursing, we're not using offensive terms. But if somebody's not able to say the words, again, genital words coming up, earmuffs if you don't like them. If somebody's not comfortable saying penis and vagina, we need to have a language we can work with. And also admit your own humanity. So if you don't know, it's okay to say you don't know, but say, why don't we go find out together? Because you probably know much better resources than they do. So when I asked who we talked to as youth, a lot of folks said, I talked to my friends. Friends often don't know any more than you do, even if they think they do. Siblings sometimes can be a really great resource, but sometimes siblings don't know either. So they and their friends might go to a website and not go to a .org or .edu, right? But if you're taking them to a website, you know to go to a .org, a .gov, a .edu. And then again, resources. You all now know about some websites and some text lines. There are always books, although those are a little outdated these days, but always offer resources, especially if you're not comfortable talking about it. Next slide, please. So the more thoughts that are important to remember is that there are sexuality topics that are appropriate for every age. So oftentimes, so in October, next month, is Let's Talk. Let's Talk is a national health awareness campaign aimed at getting adults and parents to talk to their children about sex. And oftentimes when I'm with a group of adults, they're like, wait, you want me to tell my 3-year-old about sex and having sex? And I'm like, no. I want you to tell your 3-year-old about boundaries and how to say, don't tickle me, or I don't want to hug somebody, and also about body parts. So again, if we use incorrect body parts, that sends different messages. In our elementary years, again, we're not talking about how to use condoms with 7-year-olds, but we might be talking about how to have healthy relationships with your friends, because that's a good basis for talking about healthy relationships with your partners. And then when we get into the teen years and even the middle school years, it really is time to start talking about risk prevention. So I had a 7th grade health teacher once tell me that they chose a Just Say No curriculum because in 7th grade, we just want our kids saying no. I don't disagree with that. However, if that's the only education that group of students is getting, by the time they're in 10th, 11th, or 12th grade and they want to be able to say yes, they've had no formal education on how to do so. So this is when we need to start. So Just Say No only goes so far because it doesn't tell us if you've said yes, how to protect yourself. Next slide says, it's okay to admit that you don't know. I feel like we've said this quite a few times. So again, just reinforcing the idea of buying more time by asking more questions. And for anybody who's a counselor and a therapist in this room, we're very artful at that, right? Getting people even maybe to say the things we think that they might want to be saying by asking them questions. So we want to avoid asking, though, any kind of why question. So remember my story a few moments ago about the young person who came back and said that I asked why they wanted to be trans. Why often brings up people's defenses. So if you say, why did you do that? Or why do you want to know? People are going to think they've done something wrong. We can easily change it to what makes you ask that? Or what brought that up for you today? And that's a much more open question. So here's exactly what I suggest to do if you don't know. Next slide. Breathe. Really, just keep breathing. Because I know a lot of times it's like, oh man, what do I say? So just take a breath. Always thank the person for asking the question, because that's going to encourage them to come to you the next time that they have a question. So that's a really good question, or that's an interesting question, or, I've wondered that too. Something to reinforce that they came to you. Then if you need to, ask for clarification. Well, what do you think? This is really good for values too. So if you are in a program where somebody asks you a values question and you don't know how to answer it in the minute, you can say, well, what do you think? And get some more information. That'll give you somewhere else to go with your conversation. Again, it's really okay to admit that you don't know. Last week, I had somebody ask me if Slim Jims are called Slim Jims because they make you thin if you eat a lot. I am not a nutritional expert, so I said, I don't know. But I think if you ate a lot of Slim Jims, or if you only ate Slim Jims, you might become dehydrated. But I was just like, I never met Jim. I don't know why he named them that way. But if it were appropriate, I would have said, let's look up slimjim.com and find out what the answer is. Now, that wasn't appropriate because I was talking about body image, but if it were, we could have. All right, so this is the thing that I usually do much earlier in my presentations. I've started doing this every time I'm working with a group of young people. I throw up a disclaimer. I know I'm human. I'm not trying to speak for anybody else's point of view. I can't speak for other people's experiences. I can only speak from what I've learned and what I know, and I'm still learning. So there may be times that I get it wrong. If you think I've said something wrong, please feel free to correct me. It's okay to call me out. And this is especially true if you're working with a population who's different from you demographically. For instance, if you identify as straight and you're working with LGBT youth, it's especially important for them to be able to call you out if you say a word that's maybe outdated, or if they just have a different take on it, because that's part of what makes our culture really great, right? We can see things differently. And of course, calling people out, and this is part of our ground rules with young people, is always to be respectful. So call me out, but respectfully. Next slide, we're going to actually flip to the next slide after that. So I'm going to quickly read these questions. It is about 9:45, so it's about 15 minutes left. This is a values clarification. So just think about these things. Think about what your answers are. So yes, no, or maybe. My students or youth are too young to be thinking about having sex. Next one says, sex education should be provided to all students or all young people. The third one is, my students are too young to know their gender or orientation. Premarital sex is acceptable. Yes, no, maybe. People under 18 are too young to have sex. Teen pregnancy is wrong and must be prevented. Teens should have access to birth control and condoms. Talking to my students about sex and sexuality is easy. And finally, yes, no, or maybe. Parents are solely responsible for teaching youth about sex. So I urge you to think about where you fell on that spectrum of yes, no, and maybe for each of those prompts. Because if you are feeling like your youth are too young to be thinking about having sex, maybe that's not the best topic for you to cover right now. You might want to bring in some outside help. If you are thinking that, a great example is, there's one about teen pregnancy. Teen pregnancy is wrong, it must be prevented. That may be a value some folks have, and I'm not here to argue with that, but I actually have had a colleague who would always be like, we can't have teens getting pregnant. And I'm like, be careful when you're saying that to a group of teens, because you may have just said something very negative about their family members, right? So, and this is especially multiculturally true too, right? In our Latina populations, that might be more common than maybe our white populations. So if you're saying teens can't have pregnancies, that's really, really bad. You just said something negative about their aunt, their mom, maybe their older sister. Maybe they're excited for when they get to that age and they can become a teen parent, because that might be very normal in their family. So just think about how those messages are being sent. Next slide, please. So that was just a values clarification about how do you feel about youth as sexual beings, and how comfortable are you with talking about sexuality or answering questions about sexuality. Okay, we're going to go through the next 10 slides very, very quickly. These are principles for sex education that were created by the Center for Sex Ed Education, which is out of New Jersey. It's actually Planned Parenthood of New Jersey. And this is just their list that they put at the beginning of all of their curricula around sexuality. So these are what everybody deserves with sexuality, sexuality education. So 1, everybody needs and deserves respect. And I just put funny cartoons. So if you have time to see them, great. If not, no big deal. Number 2, participants or students need to be accepted where they are. Number 3, participants learn as much or more from each other as they do from the educator. And this one says, oh, my parents are trying to talk to me about the birds and bees again. Don't they know we get that in school? That's what the school bus is for. Number 4 is that a positive approach to sex education is the best approach. And this one, the little doodle is a teacher saying, if you're not married by 30, you're a loser. There may be a lot of people not married by 30, right? Number 5 is honest, accurate information and communication about sex is essential. So in my bio, I write that I am passionate about unabashed education, because if we are Coach Carr and we are too embarrassed to talk about it, we're not sending the messages we want. Number 6, people have a fundamental right to sex education, and that's all people, which we'll talk about in one more moment. Number 7, gender equality and greater flexibility in sex role behavior help all people. So this comic says you're just not the right man for the job because he's talking to a woman. If anybody's joining me tomorrow morning, you'll hear more about that. We'll talk about LGBT identities and gender information. Number 8 says all sexual orientations and gender identities must be acknowledged. Number 9 says that sex involves more than just sexual intercourse. So like I said, it's not just about body parts and activities. And number 10, oh, nope, I lied, there is not a number 10. So special considerations. One of those principles was that everybody deserves sex education. So that's people of all identities. Youth in your groups may identify as LGBTQIA and the whole spectrum of identities, or they may have loved ones who do. And so that's part of why we need to be careful that we're not sending the message that only men and women have sex with each other, because then, like I said, folks are going to tune out. We also want to be aware of the history of our young people if we can, because we want to avoid triggers, right? So if somebody has a history of abuse, we want to just be aware of that so as not to put them in an uncomfortable situation, hearing things that maybe they're not prepared for. And then disabilities, intellectual and or physical disabilities, all individuals have a right to have information about their bodies and their feelings. And oftentimes for the IDD population, people are like, oh no, they don't need to know about that because they're functioning at, a preschooler level. However, their bodies are functioning at an adult level. So this education needs to follow their biological age, not their cognitive or functioning age. All right, so next slide, please. Here are some resources that you can share with your team. We can go back a slide. Thank you. So our website, safeteens.org. Actually, yeah, sorry, Joe.
Yep, no problem.
All right, so this is resources for them. There's also a great website called Sex Etc. There's one called Stay Teen, and if you are comfortable using Planned Parenthood, they have always really great resources, and they have a specific page just for teens. They also have a specific page for parents about how to talk to teens about sexuality, and they have specific resources and pages for educators and adults. Joe, can you go back a slide? Here are some resources for you. Sorry, forward one. Thank you. Healthy and Teen Network is a really great group of professionals who work with teens a lot and get their input, and they produce a lot of really great resources. Also, the Center for Sex Education, who those principals came from. GLSEN is an organization aimed at LGBTQ education and advocacy. It's actually I believe it used to be called the Gay and Lesbian Sex Education Network. That's where GLSEN came from, although I'm sure it's updated by now. And again, Planned Parenthood has great information. Our website also has an adult section as well. And finally, a really quick reference